So conflict minerals are an interesting topic. A lot of people think of Africa when they think of conflict minerals, and they're not wrong. The Democratic Republic of Congo is primarily, their economics are primarily driven by mining and other concepts of taking things out of the earth's crusts and manufacturing them. And we'll talk about kind of the pinch point there in a little bit about once a conflict mineral enters into a certain point of the processing, you can no longer trace where it came from. But there's a lot of other places that have minerals that we need to have, that we talk about a lot in the news and sometimes in sustainability forums, where which are in China and in Russia. It seems like especially when it comes to these super strong permanent magnets, which are made by the planet. We don't actually make them or manufacture them. We just process them into what works for us. And it's this odd situation where kind of everybody knows there's issues. And I think the Blood Diamonds movie, which came out about a decade ago, was a pretty, and kind of that entry into that concept of, whoa, where does this stuff come from? And diamonds are now, most diamonds are now manufactured, they're not mined. And so it took a decade of that sort of that political pressure, subtle social movement away from valuing that stuff. But when it comes to non-jewelry, kind of vanity kind of purchases, when it comes to buying things like iPhones and computers and electric bikes and solar panels, we end up with still having sort of a problem with all this, with conflict minerals. And as I said, the Blood Diamond movie, it kind of sparked this popular understanding of it. Policymakers had been noting it for a decade before this, knew there was some looming problems around human rights and workers' rights. And there was this big struggle about how do we take American values, which were battled over decades of union fighting with companies, to those values, how do we plump them into a massively economically distressed area like the Central Africa place? And so that's always been kind of the trick. So a conflict minerals rule was passed, and it started to impact the industry, but there's a big problem with tracking, like I said before. And so when you think about the devices that you use, there's going to be things in it. We talk about recycling, but the recycling people know the efficiency and effectiveness of recycling is extremely low. It's more of a social policy program than it is really of a minerals extraction program. And so it becomes a big issue. Here's a little slide here's me. I was a registered environmental health specialist in the state of California. That's how I initially got involved with conflict minerals. And it is Section 1502 of the Dodd-Frank Act, which is interesting because that is a financial act. And I think that's sort of a hint in some ways as to where this goes when it comes to jobs, because you can major in biology and sustainability and stuff, but that may not get you work in the conflict minerals area because it is very much a financial and acquisition area. We'll come back to that in a little bit. Here's where I went. I went into Rwanda. Rwanda is easy to enter into. It's a very, very safe country. And it's adjacent to the Democratic Republic of Congo, and the borders are porous. And so I was able to get across the border into the Democratic Republic of Congo and see some of the mining that's going on, because what happens is whatever's mined has to get to port, and the major mines are really more in the eastern part of the Democratic Republic of Congo. So you have to truck all of that or rail it all the way over to the coastal area here and on the Pacific Ocean side or the Atlantic Ocean side, and that can be really difficult. It's much, much safer to simply come over the mountains into Rwanda, then through Tanzania, and then ship it out from that other side of the continent, because conflict minerals are remarkably valuable. And that's one of the reasons why they're conflict minerals. And And so you've got a lot of mafia style organizations that employ people or enslave people, depending on who you ask, who really, these are people who don't have a lot of other economic choices. Anyway, so that's the way that it works. So I observed lots of trucks rolling through Rwanda, and in a country where almost no one owns a vehicle, I'm in a car driving around. I maybe have one of 10 cars I might see in a 24-hour period on a really busy highway someplace. And so everybody else is walking or taking truck transportation, or they're on a scooter. And the scooters aren't usually involved in the conflict minerals industry because they can't manage the weight. Otherwise, I'm certain they would be because of the weight. The chemicals we're talking about, for those who are geology majors, we're looking at tantalite, tin, gold, and tungsten. Those are really the most important ones. And this tantalite is that main one. It is used in so many processes associated with our modern society. So I'll look here a little bit about Rwanda again. If you look at the Volcans National Park, that's where you see, like, people go and see the gorillas, which I did when I was there. It wasn't 100% only a research trip. And what's fascinating about it is this complete difference. And I'll show you some pictures. The complete difference between this idea that this is a idyllic African safari experience that's all beautiful and you feel great about, and then you drive 15 miles west and there's 10,000 enslaved workers. And so it's kind of tricky. But this political boundary between Rwanda and Democratic Republic of Congo is critical, because everything changes the second you cross that boundary. And so it gets pretty tricky. But Rwanda does a really good job of making sure the only thing that's happening is transport. If they decided to stop the transport, they would be very quickly involved in a global conflict, because that just can't happen. And so they don't. They extract some money to make sure that the roads are maintained, and then they just continue working towards building their own economy independent of conflict minerals. Some nice pictures. You really can drive up, right up to the animal. Rwanda is a very rural place. So you got the darling look that everybody wants to go for in their pictures, of course. And it truly is an odd thing. And what's interesting about this part of the experience is, because when it comes to conflicts, everybody knows about the Rwanda genocide. All the people had to run out of the cities, and Rwanda was very urban. At the time, there was a couple of cities almost everyone lived in, everything else was farming or just empty area where animals just roamed. It wasn't utilized by humans in any manner. But when the people had to run away from the cities, they had to go and basically camp out here. And the first thing they had to do was protect themselves, and that protection was against predators. So almost all the apex predators were all removed from Rwanda. They were all killed. Because they were attacking people, and that's what happens when that occurs. So you end up with large populations of animals, and everybody knows this is probably maybe the second most dangerous animal in Africa after the hippo. But they're very docile. They haven't been chased by a predator for 20 years. And I did go up and see the gorillas. So at this point in the gorilla area, I can see, when I look over the mountain at night, you can see the lights from the volcanoes, which are very close to where the conflict minerals are being harvested. Here's me learning an ancient game from some of the folks that provide the services of getting up to see those gorillas, and for me to get over to the border. This is the typical picture at the border of the workers going from Rwanda to the Democratic Republic of Congo. They get a little bit of money, and instead of going into Congo deeper where it's dangerous, they ride back into Rwanda. So these folks are going back in to go back to work again. And they work in these long stints where they'll work for months, and they work, if it's light out, they're working 7 days a week, and then they come into Rwanda and they get healthcare taken care of if they can. They get some break time. do remittances, because a lot of what this is for is to send money back home. And we see people from all over Africa involved in this trade. So we talked a little bit about how this is a financial rule through the Frank-Dodds Act. So the Securities and Exchange Commission is who is responsible for enforcing this rule. So it's not an environmental rule. It's not the EPA. It's not even anything associated with local books, although there are some states we'll get to in a minute that have passed some of their own rules. But the SEC is responsible for enforcing this as part of the Frank-Dodds Act, and they frankly have no idea what to do. They still don't, and this act has been around for a decade. The SEC, to give them a little bit of credit, since I just kind of dished on them about they still don't know what to do. Hey, the stuff like Madoff, which was a decade ago, that kind of stuff is still happening. You see it all the way up to the Ponzi schemes and the fraud that's going on with cryptocurrencies. And so they are so busy. This is not even on their radar screens. But conflict minerals are being discussed. You can find a lot of information if you want to do some studies on it. I wouldn't recommend a dissertation because it'd be extremely difficult, but a master's thesis or a senior level paper would be great for this topic of conflict minerals. And also you could write a paper in pretty much any class, whether it's a chemistry class, a biology class, or a sustainability class or sustainable architecture class. Conflict minerals are all part of things that are inside almost everything. Again, we've already talked about the four main minerals that we see. Here's examples of things that it's in. And so basically it's in everything, and as digitization and things like nest and ring become more prevalent, you're starting to see these conflict minerals in pieces of things that are in everybody's home that we really rely on. I don't think I could manage my Amazon deliveries if I didn't have my ring. So, it's something I feel like I have to have, and a lot of people feel the same way. And it's in so many things. The example is the shoes. You'd never think that somebody running a 100-yard sprint would have conflict minerals in it, but it's in the shoes. So it's a blow up for those of you who are capturing this for the purpose of a paper. You can screenshot this, or you can look at the YouTube later and grab it. On the top picture up above it's a funeral procession. There's no occupational health association associated with workers in conflict minerals. OSHA is something which is kind of uniquely first world, and so there's a lot of problems, and people dress up and they go to these things pretty commonly because it's not a safe place to work. The picture on the bottom left, I did not take. So I got this picture off the web. I had a great difficulty actually photographing anything that I saw. I was basically smuggled across the border, but only a short distance. And there was conditions, and one of those conditions was that I didn't take any photos. And the reason for that was for my own protection. And that's because there is militias guarding that border and guarding any information getting out about what's happening there. And if we had stumbled across them and they looked through the phone, they saw those pictures, we'd have problems. And I did have some problems actually in Kigali with pictures. So I know that it is true. You could have some problems with that. Here's some more screenshots that I took off the internet. They just represent kind of what I saw. My pictures weren't nearly as dramatic or emotional as these. They looked like it just looks like an industrial process happening with people walking around, at least from my distance with my iPhone. So the Dodd-Frank rule is where this comes into, and it's a very complicated rule. It's very complicated to figure out what's going on. I do have a flow chart about how the law works, and it's really tricky. And that's because of the process, because the enforcers, the inspectors, or the enforcers of the Dodd-Frank Act, they don't go to the mines and check out what's going on. They don't have access. So they have to look downstream. And when the Frank-Dodds Act was proposed, a lot of people started changing some of their processes so that it was impossible to trace where a certain conflict mineral came from. And there's some chemical ways to do it, say, radiation levels, impurity levels, which are all unique to the fingerprints of where they're coming from. And if you wash that out, it now is impossible. And the way the act works is if you can't prove that it is from a conflict zone, then the material is perfectly fine. So all you really have to wash is the minerals and you're ready to go. It's a lot like the same thing we've seen with, money laundering. It's mineral laundering. There are consulting firms that provide the services for demonstrating that a company has complied with this part of the rule. At first, they popped up all over the place and there was tons of jobs. That is significantly reduced now that the process of doing this evaluation and auditing on behalf of the Act has been incorporated into the audit protocols and the business practices of the industries. It's now part of doing business. So it's not a separate standalone rule. And that's probably good. We've seen regulatory affairs, environmental compliance, for instance, when the Clean Water Act passed, that became a specialty area. Engineers and environmental specialists were hired, and it slowly has worked its way into sort of normal operations. And probably compliance is better that way. So you don't really have a doer and a checker like we used to, where somebody who actually does the environmental compliance and then somebody who checks to see that it was done. That used to be the model. Now you have that environmental compliance integrated into operations. And so the checkers have a lot less work to do. So there's a lot fewer checkers. And so now it's the lesson learned is that with a lot of industries, what happens is you need to learn the core industry, and then you pick up sort of the certificate or the stackable credentials or something associated with a topic like conflict minerals, and that makes you more valuable in the workplace. Here's an example of where the traceability happens. Of course, there's a mine, and then it gets mined, it gets put in a truck, it gets driven somewhere, and then somebody buys it. And then that truck goes back and gets some more. It might be the same militia that's doing it. It might be the same company, but a lot of times they're different. It all depends. Vertical integration is very much part of how mafia-style militias work. They want to control everything from the mines all the way through to the last time they touch the product, because at each stage there's a little bit of profit. So they're just optimizing their profits, and it's a brutal world. And so that's why it's conflict minerals. Once the minerals hit the smelter, they lose their fingerprint, and you start to lose that ability to trace. And so what Frank Dodd's compliance is all about right now is about getting to those smelters. And the smelters are not just put anywhere. The smelters are extremely expensive. They're very high-tech kind of work. And it's, not something that you just pop up anywhere. And so the militia isn't doing it. The smelters are actually legitimate, and they also process other things besides conflict minerals. And so this is the key point: getting access to it, getting access to the books, seeing that recording is done accurately, being able to observe things yourself is all extremely difficult. And again, they just don't know how to enforce this rule. All right. Through, I would say, altruistic actions, companies like Apple and other high users of conflict minerals have put into place policies within their manufacturing that is supposed to eliminate. And they report that there actually has been a reduction in the militia's revenues. Of course, militias are very good at adapting, and they have done so. They've done some more vertical integration. A lot of the mining and transport is all now the same company. They actually have enough wealth to possibly be building smelters by now. We don't know, because they're unregistered smelters that aren't they're not registered by any particular central government. So the auditors don't necessarily even know that they're there. But it looks like we moved a little bit in the right direction. We'll have to see over the long run of how that plans out. A lot of it, there's secondary consequences. When the revenues dropped, it also meant that a lot of the rebel groups, which are the militias, no longer had the ability to pay their soldiers. And there's nothing worse in a militia than soldiers that go unpaid for a long time. They're not volunteer soldiers like like maybe the U.S. military. They expect to be paid, or they go do something else, move to another country or whatever. And so there's been some definite changes. Because of that, we don't know if it's good or bad. We just know that it's different. Organizations like Greenpeace, another job place, has felt like there's been a lot of good movement in conflict minerals management. And it's not just Apple. This is an older article because a lot of the research was done on this back during the trip. And now we see that there's even more, but there's more access to minerals that are needed from now other countries that previously weren't mining them because it wasn't economically viable. But now that the cost is increased because of pressure on the market, some of these areas in China and Russia are now available. Now, of course, as of February, we now have to ask the question, is tin coming from Russia a conflict mineral? That is a really hard question. I don't think we can cover that today. It's just part of the deal. But we have got continued pledges by other companies to reduce these minerals. That's continuing to put downward pressure on the ability to be in this conflict minerals business, and is starting to legitimize it more and more. Maryland was the second state to pass a law. This is old. There's many other states now that have done it. But again, it's really cool to pass a law to say, we don't want conflict minerals, but how do we actually do anything is always still the big question. Right now, it's mostly reporting. Nobody wants to put in their 10-4 report or their that's an annual stockholder report. Nobody wants to put that stuff in it. We are a massive user of conflict minerals. Everybody wants to write, we've reduced conflict minerals by 50% or something, because there is this pressure, and it's a law which is very much uses peer pressure and social pressure to be enforced, not practical enforcement. Europe passed their own conflict mineral law as well, and so we didn't just divert everything away from the United States and into Europe at a lower price. China has not, so conflict minerals are flowing into China, and China is a big user of it. And of course, that becomes really difficult when manufacturing U.S. products by major manufacturers is done in China. Where do those minerals come from? The traceability is extremely difficult. You really have to be a sleuth to be able to pull this off. Apple believes they're conflict free. That's pretty cool. We saw that the conflict minerals rule is there.